Flight 1549 initially was completely routine and unremarkable for the first 100 seconds.
In this video, we're going to rewind the clock and look at US Airways Flight 1549, captained by Chesley Sully Sullenberger, when in 2009, the Airbus A320 encountered a pack of Canada geese out of JFK Airport in the US, losing power on both engines and eventually ditching in the Hudson River. This was an example of great piloting skills and great captaincy and teamwork, and today we'll examine three key decision frameworks and principles that Chesley and his crew employed on that day, and we'll also examine one area where Sully could have picked up his game and done a bit better. G'day and welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, I'm Matthew Dank. I'm a former Australian Navy and Air Force pilot and flight simulator instructor. I've had a few years out of the cockpit and I've recently returned to the flying game with a new Australian airline. And on this channel, we cover pilot performance, pilot learning, and mental fitness tactics to help get the most out of flying careers. Okay, US Airways Flight 1549, back in 2009, widely regarded as an example of excellent crew coordination and team performance, which led to the lives of 155 people being saved on that fateful day. Chesley Sully, as he's known, a legend of the industry, after this incident and saving his crew and passengers on that day, has gone on to be a renowned safety expert, a US ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Authority at the rank of ambassador, and he's really championed the cause of pilots in lobbying federal aviation authorities and also airlines to provide the resources, provide the time and experience to get pilots up to the highest possible level so they can safely serve the public. So Flight 1549 was a phenomenal team effort, there's no question. It was also a very fortunate day for those on board due to the proximity of the Hudson River as a landing option, the amount of rescue vessels which were close by, and also some other factors behind the scenes. But what we're looking at today is delving into these decision-making frameworks that Sully employed based on his extensive experience and background, and also frameworks that we're taught throughout our aviation careers and that we can apply in malfunctions that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Okay, now the three frameworks we're going to look at today are ANCA, AICC, and FPM. ANCA, Aviate, Navigate, Communicate, Administrate, a general principle for prioritising the safety of the aircraft and the flight path itself. AICC is a mnemonic or a tool for handling engine malfunctions and identifying and dealing with an engine malfunction correctly. And last is a term which any pilot will be well across these days, and that's flight path management, a major behavioural competency that operators, licensing authorities look for as a behaviour and attribute that pilots actively promote, actively prioritise at all times. So by employing these frameworks and these principles in even the most precarious situations, pilots can maximise the chances of safely recovering their aircraft and safely getting passengers and crew back to terra firma. Okay, ANCA, or Aviate, Navigate, Communicate, Administrate, probably the most fundamental set of principles that are drilled into pilots through military training in Australia, and it's certainly something that's seen much more broadly across the industry. Priority one, always aviate. Fly the aircraft. Focus on the fundamental job of a pilot, and that's to strap into the seat, look at the instruments in the outside world, and fly that aircraft. Do not get distracted or go down a tunnel. Number two, navigate. Think, where does the aircraft need to go next, be it to avoid terrain or an obstacle, or to minimise the amount of fuel burn, or to move towards an aerodrome or an airport where the aircraft can be safely landed. Okay, number three, communicate. Whether it's talking to air traffic control, obtaining a clearance, or notifying them of what we need to do, communicating is the third priority and is only served after we've taken care of aviate and navigate. And lastly, priority four, administrate. So checklist actions, other tertiary tasks, other things that aren't time critical and don't need to be performed at a moment's notice, they can be performed last of all. Okay, the pyramid view provides a really illustrative and a really handy way to look at this. Aviate is always the foundation, always the pillar upon which our other priorities are built. We always need to be revisiting our priority order also and thinking whether I'm approaching the task or the malfunction at hand in the right sense. Probably the best example of when the ANCA framework wasn't properly applied was Eastern Airlines Flight 4101 from New York to Miami back in 1972. Famously, the aircraft had a landing gear system problem and all the personnel on the cabin, or I should say on the flight deck, were preoccupied with a malfunction. They were preoccupied with a light bulb of all things, and they were fault finding and trying to get to the bottom of this issue when the aircraft actually descended and impacted the Everglades resulting in the loss of most of the lives on board that day. So a fundamental failure to simply aviate, maintain awareness of the aircraft's altitude, heading, airspeed, and safely control that whilst other crew members dealt with the malfunction and checklist actions, etc. themselves. All right, the second framework I'm going to introduce today that is important and that Sully employed very effectively is AICC, or Announce, Identify, Confirm, Commence. This is a framework that's taught for handling engine malfunctions. And even in the most severe situation, like you can see here with a badly damaged engine with flames evident from the combustion chamber, malfunctions like this can be effectively handled and effectively prioritised by using AICC. So why do we use this sort of mnemonic? Why do we use this sort of acronym to deal with an engine malfunction? Two big reasons are so that the aircrew and the pilots in particular can deal with the physiological response of a malfunction like this, which is often going to be something called the startle or surprise response, and a sense of anxiety that generates. And they can go from that position, that starting point, through a step-by-step framework to become more aware of the situation and then to decide how to deal with the situation and take it to its conclusion. So it's really just a problem-solving framework for dealing with these engine malfunctions, whilst importantly flying the aircraft, observing that fundamental aviate priority from the ANCA framework we saw just a moment ago. So let's step through AICC, how it would work in practice. So a fundamental point here that I need to mention is AICC is designed to be employed in a crewed environment where you've got one pilot flying the aircraft, being the PF, and one aircraft monitoring the performance of the PF and monitoring where the aircraft is going. So that's the PM, pilot monitoring. So between the two of them, they will run through this mnemonic, this acronym, and effectively get to the bottom of the problem. How it would typically work is whoever notes the problem with the aircraft, most likely the PM who's not flying, they will state engine problem. That enables all the crew to become aware that there is an issue with an engine, and it allows the pilot flying to do just that, focus on the flying the aircraft, understand there's a problem with the engine without wanting to go into diagnosis mode and get that aircraft to a safe height and a safe position following single engine failure procedures. So this at times will mean altering the aircraft flight path and changing the vertical profile to maximize climb rates and performance, and then get the aircraft to a certain safe height when the pilot flying will be happy to call for the next step. The next step would be for the pilot flying to call, identify the failure. So this directs the pilot monitoring to go heads down. So rather than looking out the window where the aircraft is going, look down at the engine instruments and other system indications and spend a few moments just methodically and systematically identifying what has gone wrong with a particular engine or system. On completion of that, the pilot monitoring will then give their recommendation as to what the issue is. For example, it might be number 2 engine fire, or it might be flame out number 1 engine. That's the end of the identify step. And the next step is for the pilot flying to independently verify and independently assess what's going on with the aircraft by themselves, looking at the engine indications and the systems on the aircraft. So together, these are absolutely critical steps, as you can imagine. If the wrong problem is identified and if the other pilot then confirms that incorrect diagnosis, the crew could then go on and conduct a checklist that's incorrect, potentially shutting down the wrong engine. And step 4 here is to commence. So commence checklist actions, however they are appropriate. That might be referring to a hard copy paper checklist. It might be referring to an aircraft system inbuilt checklist, ECAS or ECAM, or it might be going from memory and conducting essential memory items without reference to any checklist at all. And in the case of a major malfunction, that will likely involve shutting down an engine. So AICC, announce, identify, confirm, commence. Very methodical, step-by-step process to triage and handle the malfunction whilst maintaining crew awareness of what the actual aircraft is doing and ensuring critically that the correct decision is made. Okay, the last principle or framework we'll look at here is flight path management. So this is very much in vogue in 2024. It's a major priority in training organisations, a major factor we see in safety incidents, and it is simply that, controlling the flight path of the aircraft. Defined as the planning, execution and assurance of the guidance and control of aircraft trajectory and energy in flight or on the ground. So planning, knowing what the aircraft needs to do, and making it happen. The flight path trajectory is defined as the lateral, longitudinal and vertical plane and also the energy state of the aircraft. So in 2022, the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, issued this advisory circular 120 of 123, giving guidance on how operators or airlines and training authorities can meet the requirements of the FAA for flight path management. So a very detailed document which came out of years of extensive study and collaboration by a number of working groups, and it really stipulates the standards and the requirements that operators and pilots need to reach in order to operate aircraft as safely as possible in regard to flight path management. So let's take a look at some of its caveats to achieve effective flight path management. You can see here under point 2, point 1, point 2, each pilot is responsible for being fully aware of the current and desired flight path of the aircraft and being fully capable of manually flying the aircraft to achieve the desired flight path. It goes on to discuss the roles of the pilot flying and pilot monitoring, and you'll note here that I've got pilot not flying crossed out. So a number of years ago, this terminology was updated where the pilot who wasn't flying was known as just that, the pilot not flying, and terminology was updated to indicate that that person needs to be known as the pilot monitoring, as monitoring is an active and important task in and of its own self. Okay, under paragraph 5.3.2, effective flight path monitoring, pilots should be trained to recognise when the airplane is not conforming to the planned flight path and on strategies for appropriate intervention. They should be trained that there are predictable situations during each flight when the risk of a flight path deviation is increased, heightening the importance of proper task and workload management. And lastly, training should explicitly address the management of deviations or off-path operations and include strategies for managing automation surprises and unknown situations. So this is about expecting the unexpected and being able to get the aircraft back on the rails when things go sideways or when the automation doesn't behave as is expected. So together, these principles really lay down a solid foundation for handling the aircraft flight path through all different flight regimes and all different situations, be it normal operations, malfunctions, weather events, anything else. So flight path management might sound relatively easily, right? Know where the aircraft's going to go, steer it in that direction, end of story. Sometimes it is that simple, quite often it isn't. You can imagine how complex the flight decks of modern aircraft are. You can imagine with a few system failures, maybe some bad weather, maybe some mountainous terrain, and the need to climb and take off at night, things can get very tricky. And with failures thrown in the mix, quite easily pilots can be overwhelmed and can be misdirected or distracted. So flight path management is all about that A out of ANCA, which is aviate, just prioritising and using all methods and tools we can in the crewed environment, really to assure the aircraft's trajectory or its flight path has been closely monitored by both pilots and it is in fact going where it is desired. All right, let's assess Sully and his crew's handling of the malfunction in terms of the ANCA acronym, Aviate, Navigate, Communicate, Administrate. And to do that, we're going to open up and run through a ATSB, or I should say an NTSB clip of the actual flight profile. So I'm moving to the 20-second mark and I'm hitting play now. Right, we can see here reconstruction of the flight. The pilots have selected the flaps up through 2,500 feet, 207 knots.
Here, Johnny 2760 is 5,000, turning your right to 150.
Johnny 2760, climb maintain 10,000.
After takeoff check was completed and they've impacted birds. Birds are heard thumping into the aircraft. And you can hear that Hot 1, which would have been the left-hand seat captain, which was Sully, has stated we've got rollback on one, then rollback on both, indicating that the engine have both reduced power. And I do note that Sully in the left-hand seat was pilot monitoring with Jeff in the right-hand seat, pilot flying at the time. Okay, next up, Sully selects ignition start. He states, I'm starting the APU, then my aircraft, and a handover occurs. Sully calls, get the QRH, loss of thrust on both engines. Then puts out a mayday call.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds to lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
The priority is being to get the aircraft in a safe configuration, in a glide at a steady airspeed, and then go for actions needed to restart the engine. And that was the ignition selection. You'll also note that the APU has been started, which is in fact is a much later step in the checklist that Sully has called for. Okay, Sully's put out the Mayday call. He's advised ATC that they need to turn back to LaGuardia. They've got a left heading 220, so the turn's commenced. And in order to make good on that, to get to the direction they want to be flying in, they've had to communicate with ATC, and he's done that in a quite succinct manner.
So you can see here discussion occurring amongst the pilots in the background. This is their procedure stepping through the checklist and attempting to get engines producing power so that they can fly away.
If we can get it for you, do you want to try to land 1813?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
All right, Cactus 1549. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
So a good example here that communication might be the priority of the air traffic control at this point in time, but it is not the priority of the pilots. They're focusing on flying the aircraft. They've got it lined up there almost with the Hudson, and they're still attempting to get power response out of those engines and carry out their checklist.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
Okay, Sully has communicated to ATC that the aircraft's going in the Hudson. They're through 665 feet descending, so from now on they really have no further options. Okay, Aviate's being taken care of because they have the aircraft still in a glide. They're on trajectory for the Hudson River, and they've prioritised those key action items out of the checklist to get those engines up and running if they possibly can as quickly as possible. Navigation-wise, they're just now deviating from a heading 220 to be parallel with the Hudson River, so they've effectively decided that that's their only landing position or situation available. Communication has occurred with ATC as is necessary. From this point onwards at 660 feet, there'll be no further communication, so they're not wasting any time on that, and they've passed on the information that ATC needs, which is the aircraft's going in the Hudson. And lastly, administration. There's still checks going on in the background, and pretty soon the crew are going to start deploying flaps and getting the aircraft ready for ditching into water. Okay, so that's a proximity alert for the ground in the aircraft. Flaps are coming out. Warnings are going off in the cockpit. And they're not wasting time talking to air traffic control, which would be futile. So overall, the ANCA mnemonic, or the ANCA framework, I think was very effectively applied, very effectively handled by two experienced pilots. They minimised any non-effective time, they positioned the aircraft well, and they carried out what checks they could to try to get those engines up and running, providing power so that they could avoid going in the water. It was a great job. Okay, next up, let's have a look at how the pilots handled that engine malfunction. And we'll see how closely the crew follow the AICC flow. You've seen from the video the first indication of bird strike was birds sighted visually, then the impact sound, and then Sully stating we've got rollback, both of them. So seeing birds, hearing the impact, then seeing the impact on the engines. From then on, effectively, the crew's jumped directly to the identify and confirm, and they've completed both of those steps. Sully has switched the ignition start switch on, which is part of the dual engine failure checklist. He's jumped straight in there from memory, taking care of a priority item. And then he's gone on to start the APU, which is in fact step K, so significantly down the checklist. Again, jumping to what he thinks is a priority item. Next up, he's taking control of the aircraft and calling for the QRH, or Quick Reference Handbook, loss of thrust on both engines checklist for the pilot monitoring to conduct. So this is not the normal flow you would expect when experiencing a engine malfunction or failure. The announce, identify, and confirm checks were all really rolled in as one, and then the PM just started commencing high priority actions out of the engine dual failure checklist. So the accident report issued by the NTSB actually really backed Sully's actions in this case. They were time critical. They were close to the ground, being about 3,000 feet, and that experienced catastrophic malfunctions on both engines. So Sully used his professional knowledge and his experience to get ahead on those first few steps and start moving forward. Okay, one area where the crew did come in for some criticism from the accident report and the NTSB was that the engines never actually failed. They kept running all throughout until water impact, whilst the PM was attempting to relight the engines. That said, this was the most appropriate checklist, and if anything was going to restore those engines and get them operating normally again and providing thrust, then this was it. So overall, this was again a top performance by the crew using their experience and the ability to anticipate key actions that are necessary in the event of a malfunction at low altitude where both engines are effectively lost. And it's worth noting here also the NTSB comments in the blue. NTSB notes that it is unreasonable to expect pilots to properly diagnose complex engine problems and take appropriate corrective actions while they are encountering an emergency condition under critical time constraints. Meaning the crew conducted a rapid assessment and they narrowed the situation down to the most likely. Made some assumptions, but they got themselves to the correct checklist and they started to action that checklist as quickly as possible given the very limited time available. All right, the last point to discuss here is flight path management, how well Sully and his crew managed the flight path of Flight 1549. You can see here from the graphic a couple of things. Firstly, from the top of the red arc here where the aircraft's on pretty much a northerly heading after the bird strike had occurred, the aircraft altitude peaks out at, in fact it's not displayed here, but it's about 3,000 feet. From then on, the airspeed's maintained, firstly 215, then about 190 all the way down, 194, 191, 189, until low level over the water. So airspeed control was quite good, as the NTSB points out, until very late in the descent. Given airspeed was pretty much constant for the majority of the descent, the vertical trajectory would have been fairly constant also, which would have been suitable for the conditions, noting the crew were in VMC or visual conditions, so not in cloud. And as it were, the crew would have needed to separate themselves from any other boats or obstacles on the Hudson. There is one thing to point out, however, regarding the flight path of the aircraft, and that was the airspeed towards the latter half of the descent. So the engine dual failure checklist that the pilot called for and the crew were actually running through in Section 2 contains guidance about what speed to maintain on descent. Now, the crew never got to that part of the checklist. They didn't have time. If they had had time, it would have stated to maintain green dot, which is the best lift to drag ratio, which also would have given the best glide range. We can see here discussion in the NTSB report under Section 2.3.3 descent and ditching airspeed. The flight crew was not able to initiate Part 2 of the engine dual failure checklist, which contained an airspeed guidance for pilots to follow if an engine restart is considered impossible and ditching is anticipated. So again, this would have called for the aircraft to maintain green dot airspeed, and Sully stated after the accident that he thought he had obtained green dot speed immediately after the bird strike and maintained it until the airplane was configured for landing. That's flaps deployed, and after deploying the flaps, maintain speed of safely above VLS, which is the lowest selectable airspeed, providing an appropriate margin to the stall. However, flight data indicated that the airplane was below green dot speed and at VLS, or slightly less than that for most of the descent, and about 15 to 19 knots below VLS during the last 200 feet. And the last 200 feet was a critical piece here because the aircraft was significantly below the ideal speed for that manoeuvre, that is ditching into the water, and that resulted in a high nose attitude, a high angle of attack, and a large descent rate into the water. In fact, they came down into the water at 750 feet per minute, which is pretty similar to what an aircraft will fly on finals for a runway, instead of the intended or the ideal descent rate specified in the manual, which was 210 feet per minute. On this point, the NTSB in the safety report stated that the captain's difficulty maintaining his intended airspeed during the final approach resulted in a high angle of attack, which contributed to the difficulties in flaring the airplane, the high descent rate at touchdown, and the fuselage damage. And this damage was the reason the aircraft was taking on water and actually slowly sinking after water impact. And it was also the reason why the rear doors were not usable and the rear slides could not be deployed. So whilst overall the flight path was well managed, it was the latest stage of the descent where airspeed got low. Sully flying obviously was fixated on getting into the river and making a safe landing, and he dropped that airspeed out of his scan, and the pilot monitoring wasn't giving the best backup that he could have. Luckily, the damage to the aircraft wasn't extensive, and all passengers and crew could get off of the airplane. It's worth noting here in Sully's defence that the guidance here that US Airways and Airbus manuals contain very little guidance on pilots and flying techniques during a ditching to achieve recommended airplane attitude and airspeed at touchdown. Going on stating that it's unrealistic to expect them to recall the relevance of such critical information during an emergency without regular periodic reinforcement. This, I think, is the key thing, periodic reinforcement.
Because the majority of the flight time for all air transport category flight planes is spent at high altitudes above 25 or even above 35,000 feet, simulated training events for dual engine failures are simulated at this level, giving lots and lots of time, more than 10 minutes, for crews to go through checklists and practice a relight or a restart of engines. And in the training scenarios that Sully and his pilot monitoring were trained on, the training scenario resulted in one engine being restarted and did not result in that aircraft having to ditch. So in a way, it was a limited or slightly canned scenario where both engines flamed out or failed, but they were restarted, or at least one was restarted, allowing the aircraft to fly away and avoiding the scenario of having to prepare for and go ahead with the ditching of the aircraft. In my experience, because ditching is so rare and dual engine failures are so rare, training just doesn't go there and doesn't support crews like this by providing high pressure, time critical requirements to set up an aircraft for ditching after takeoff. So if you consider that he probably didn't have more than one opportunity to practice a water landing, and that one opportunity was at the start of his training on the A320, there was no cyclical or cyclic simulator events, and there was no other training or reinforcement provided. Considering these things, he did an absolutely top-rate job getting that aircraft in the water with minimal damage. All right, that is the video. They are the core things we have covered today. General prioritization framework, aviate, navigate, communicate, administrate, the engine shutdown prioritization tool, AICC, and lastly, flight path management, the primary duty of all pilots. We can see how their superior experience and expertise really allowed them to make the right decision at the right time, even though there were some slight errors in the airspeed towards the end of the approach and water entry. So in my view, Sully is rightly seen as a hero, rightly seen as an ambassador and a champion of aviation, a champion of pilots' causes and pilots' training. And I just hope he sticks around and keeps supporting the cause for a lot longer. Okay, I'll leave you with this one. This is a quote from Sully in regards to what got him through on that day. He says, one way of looking at this might be that for 42 years I've been making small, regular deposits in the bank of experience, education and training, and on January 15, the balance was sufficient so that I can make a very large withdrawal. I think there's food for thought for all of us in that quote right there, and I think the gradual, progressive and continuing education, continuing ability to test and expand our skill sets is really pivotal, and we can see how well it serves Sully, and we can see how that's an example for all of us. All right, that's the video for today. A lot's been said about Sully and his epic efforts on 1549. If you've got thoughts yourself that you'd like to add, comment below. If you've got some feedback as to how these principles and frameworks have been employed by yourself or others in dealing with training or in-flight malfunctions, I'd love to hear about it. Otherwise, thanks for joining me and stay tuned for my next video.